So my first question for you is, you do have a lot of experience in a lot of different subsectors of your industry. How
Uh,
did you get where you are now in your career?
yeah, so I guess professionally, for me, all of this comes back to chemistry. My academic training, my degrees have all been in chemistry. So I started that back in 2006, did my master's then, and then went on to a PhD and sort of stayed along the track academic path so far as I could go. So I did a postdoc in a different chemistry lab after my PhD. Then I started my own lab to do some of my own chemistry research. And at every point along the way, there were different chemical problems, but one of the main threads, no matter what the chemistry was, it didn't matter what pills and potions we were trying to make. One of the things that always came up was how to do things safely. That was sort of part and parcel of the job. You sort of done it because you needed to do it to get in the lab and do what you really wanted. But the larger rumbling underneath that theme really was a lot of the stuff that you would see in the chemistry news to do with safety, and those being, accidents in labs, much bigger accidents with more people involved on manufacturing sites. A lot of it happening seemingly all of the time. There's no shortage of awareness that safety is a big deal in chemistry. Because a lot of things can catch fire, a lot of things can explode, a lot of things can send you to sleep very quickly. But still, there's something going on. There's challenges there that make these things happen. And I was always very, very curious about that. Just thinking, why is there this seeming disconnect between a community that knows that things are very, very dangerous all the time in this field, but still these things seem to happen. So there was just a sense there, a feeling, a suspicion, I guess, that there was not the full story being told, or more positively, I just simply didn't understand all the things at that time that were really involved in safety, and why, despite seemingly high levels of awareness that all these things can go wrong. So at the time of doing anything in safety, this is a long way to say that it wasn't always the case that I was ever going to do anything proactive or anything company based or anything like that at all. It was just simply that curiosity of, why are these two things in existence, that you have the awareness plus a lot of things going wrong nonetheless. So, in terms of your question of having some experience in different fields, the first thing was actually to think about how do you how do you go from something being just a curiosity to something that you can actually do something about? How do you move away from just tweeting how bad a particular event is and actually thinking about how you stop stuff like that happening in the future? So it wasn't easy to get going at all. It's especially when you're going down an academic track, there is increasing incentive and pressure to very, very much hyper specialize in one thing. And the sort of stuff that I'd been doing in my training and the sort of science that my team was doing when I started independently wasn't really in any way safety focused at all. It was focused very much on the hardcore fundamental science, and the safety was sort of just the thing that you did to get going on the really interesting stuff. But I think I'm grateful that in my mind, I'm the sort of person who prefers to know a little about a lot rather than a lot about a little. I'm more of a generalist than a specialist, and I quite like discipline hopping and seeing how things can tie together rather than necessarily being the world's foremost expert on a single thing. And that's, I think, and at least internally, why I wanted to take the leap to try to get some safety qualifications like the professional safety community has, and see through their eyes what their challenges are as, you know, safety professionals, safety consultants, and see if I could connect that into new ways of thinking for chemistry. So that, I think, really gets to the heart of your first question. It is not being put off by the voice in your head that says you shouldn't be doing this, you should be doing this one other thing. You know, it's having that little bit of calculated risk to say, I'll try this other thing, I'll see if I can understand it, and then bring them together. So that's how the chemistry and the safety came together. And then in terms of trying to get some experience in other fields or subfields, like you said, that is at the point that you've dipped your toes in the water, then you've opened yourself up to an entire other community of people. And that was the real blessing in disguise, that and through a rather serendipitous networking event at our shared alma mater, I met my co-founder, Paul, who's a safety professional and has been in the field for many, many years, longer than I had even really appreciated it. And through speaking to him and learning about what he does day to day and speaking to all the people that he's connected with, you start to get a sense of this other world of people and safety that was at one time for me completely disconnected, because I was over in the world of chemistry and that's what I was supposed to be doing. But all of it comes back to making those connections between worlds rather than being too deeply embedded in one, rather than spreading yourself out.
Yeah, something that we get taught quite a lot in our uni lectures is about the importance of different kinds of linkages and social
really? Okay.
capital. Yeah, it's quite heavily in our course.
Right.
Another
Is
question that, oh, sorry.
No, well, so just it does really capture me when people see the value of that. So I was just curious, like, is there any examples that have stuck out for you and what you've learned, or, you know, and the fact that someone is trying to teach you that this is an important skill to have if you can
Yeah.
nurture it. Like, is there anything that you've come across or stories that you've heard?
Mainly last year we had a class that was called entrepreneurial capital, I think, and it was just about like the 4 kinds of capital. One of them is social. So that was like a whole 2 or 3 weeks just on the social capital subject.
Yeah.
So it was kind of just stressing the importance of making like close ties and weak ties, and just the kind of theory surrounding how if you have more social links, then you're more likely to just be successful and have access to more resources.
Yeah, that's an interesting add-on, I think, because that's clearly, you know, if you know more people, you can find a path towards a particular goal. I guess the side I was coming at that ties into what you've just said is the more people you can expose yourself to, the more you can absorb their points of view, their ideas, their own perspective on problems, and even see solutions to their problems that they didn't know exist, and perhaps vice versa. You know, there might be a problem already solved in one field that could really help out other people in another field who don't even know that anyone is ever working on that problem.
Yeah,
That's the thing that I find really cool about this. And you see that a lot in, like, if you see interview profiles or journalistic profiles of people who have, in the eyes of society, done well, one of the things that really strikes me is that the problem that they have solved hasn't come from thinking the way that people in their field normally think. It's by playing elsewhere and seeing, and therefore being able to make connections that to them through that play seems obvious, that to no one else working more traditionally could possibly see. Now, I'm not saying that is the case for me, but I'm saying that's the sort of thing that inspires me. And I think it's not necessarily something that has to be endowed on a special few. I think it's a way that you can train yourself to be. That's what I find most inspiring about all of that.
Yeah, I think it is really interesting how different practices can just be transformed into a different industry so easily, as long as you like take the time to consider that it could be used.
Absolutely.
So on the next topic, I would like to ask you, obviously social ties are an important part of entrepreneurship for you. Do you think there's any kind of pattern or formula that goes towards becoming a successful entrepreneur?
Wow. Yeah. The question you've asked there's probably got 1,000 books written behind it. And I don't think that question will ever stop being asked. And I think that's why it's good to have individual perspectives, because you won't hear the same story twice.
Yeah.
Um, on my side, like, I'm working with 4 other entrepreneurs at the minute for some teaching work that I'm doing, and they've got 4 seemingly completely different paths to my own, and completely different sectors. But there are nonetheless some commonalities that come up that I can share with you here. Principle amongst all of them, if I'm forced at the cliff edge here to pick out one thing, is comfort with failure. Not being perfect, not getting it right first time, being very open to what you absolutely don't know or don't have a clue about. I put this in the language of how I've trained as a scientist. A lot of what you do as an entrepreneur is an experiment. It's taking a calculated risk and getting the feedback from that to see how you can refine that craft and move it towards the vision that you have for your business, or the image you have of the product that you want to create, or the goal that you have to do some social good through your enterprise. Whatever that is, I don't think you can get anywhere near what you want to do if you're not comfortable with failure. It's a conversation perhaps a bit outside of this one, but that's partly why I've been so interested in other work and looking at things like the imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon, because so much of that is really someone's poorly justified but completely understandable fear of failure. And what most folks don't understand is that the failure is a much larger data set than the successes that you have along the way. It's much, much easier to build up small experiments and things that have gone wrong, things that didn't work out, than, those unicorn moments where you make a big leap forward in the business that you want to have. So if you imagine that you're not comfortable with failure, or you procrastinate so much that you don't do anything, or something like imposter experiences shout in your head and hold you back, what you're doing is robbing yourself of the biggest possible data set that you can get a hold of towards success. And that data set is all those failures. If you don't do any of them, you don't have any failures, you don't have any data to work from, you don't have any feedback with which to genuinely get yourself to the next step. So, if I think about some of the stuff that I've done along the way, so I keep saying that I've trained as an academic, so moving into the business space was never an easy thing for me. It was never, I dare say, natural or intentional at first. I didn't know anything about it, and I did procrastinate for a long time because I came from a background where I put a lot of pressure on myself to get good marks in class, high grades in school and all of that sort of stuff. And so even the prospect of not doing well or not being the best at something really shook me. But to do anything up until this point, to even be at the point where I've been able to speak with you and welcome you as an intern to work with us, that would never, ever have got close had it not been for several failures and just trying stuff out. For example, we don't need to go into the details here, but the first form of working in a safety business before getting to now, business had a completely different name. It seemed a lot more narrow. It was working on one thing, left zero scope for trying out other stuff or speaking to broader people. It was very, very narrow, and the vision was almost non-existent. That original company branding scope has been completely burned and binned and started again. But ultimately, doing it was important, because had that not happened, had that failure not happened, nothing would have gone after it, because that was the crucial first steps to say, here's how you move sideways out of the academic world into the business world. And now, looking back 3 years later, at the point that we're speaking, I don't have any worries or regrets about those failures and the countless others that I've not described in this example, because without it, nothing else would have been. And it really is a much bigger idea than this sort of selfish example of me. Like, one of the things you hear a lot from psychologists who study regret is the most common thing that people regret is not actions that they've taken, but inaction, stuff that they didn't do or didn't say. You know, if you're lying on your deathbed, you focus more on the things that you wish you had done, the places you wish you had seen, the people you wish you had spoken to more. All of that stuff is what floods you with regret, not the stuff that you did and got wrong or messed up. At least you did those things, and at least you know. Because I think the most excruciating thing for anyone in the end is not knowing. You know, what if can be both exciting and excruciating at the same time. What if is what you ask when you have an idea and you think about exploring it. But it's also the question you ask if you're looking back and think, what if I had just tried that? You know, what if I'd just done that one little thing and not been so worried about failing at it? You know, that's where I'm at. So there's that, circling back, fear of failure, I think, is one of the things you really need to dance with if you want to try anything in business or entrepreneurship, because it will keep coming back. And it's the ability to manage that keeps you moving in the forward direction.
Yeah, that sounds like good advice for anyone that would want to do anything in terms of entrepreneurship.
Well, what about you? When I say that, like, you're very much embedded in this space at the minute and studying it. Does anything in that point on failure or anything related to it resonate with what you're thinking about for the future?
Yeah, I think it is a good point in that you should definitely prefer to try things that maybe you think might be out of your reach, rather than to just think, maybe, like, I don't have the qualifications for that job or that opportunity, so I shouldn't bother. Right. So it's definitely worth at least trying something so that you can know if you have the abilities, and even if you don't, you can always get feedback if you don't succeed. Yeah.
So, I mean, it sounds like we agree with each other, but I'm also thinking, I mean, like, what are you thinking now as your next step? Like, is there something that you're going to go for, even although you're aware that it might be scary? Or is there something that you find scary that you're not sure that you're going to go for?
I would say just like generally applying for jobs after uni, like
Okay.
because there's so many people that would be applying with so much experience that I haven't had. I think that's probably the most off-putting thing, is knowing that there's so many other candidates.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. That point very much links to failure. I think the other thing, we've certainly spoken to each other about this offline. It's not just the fear of failure, it's the fear of how you compare to other people. And that's the other thing that we're sort of veering down into this imposter territory again. I can't really help myself once we start, but I think that's another thing, like back to your original question on traits of an entrepreneur. It's also being comfortable with realizing that you're always going to compare yourself to other people, but also reconciling the fact that you have to put those blinkers on in order to achieve what you want to achieve. It can't always be about chasing competition. If it's about chasing competition, you'll never do anything original or innovative, because you'll always just be trying to keep up with the Joneses and being second best to someone who's already been there and done it. That's another really important point that you've hit on there.
Yeah. On that point as well, in terms of being a competitor within any industry, how would you say that you gain a loyal customer base, and how do you portray your value to the customer compared to competitors? Like, how would you make your customers feel more personally attached to you than other competitors?
Yeah, we could certainly look at this generally speaking. And I think in my case, really without ever meaning it, sort of hit upon that as a point of momentum to give this a go. You know, we're working in the safety space. I thought that I was only ever really interested in safety because it related to what I was doing in chemistry. But it took me a long time to realise that I'd grown up with a lot of that. You know, my dad had been involved in a major accident in Scotland in the late 80s. You know, anyone in Scotland has heard of the Piper Alpha disaster, more than likely, if you're of a particular generation. And I've made no secret about that when we've been speaking from a safety perspective. So that took a long time to realise, but what came off the back of that is it made it very, very clear to anyone that I've been in conversation with that we're not messing around. You know, this is something, it means more than just making money. This is, it's something else on top of that. So that was, you know, from our side, that was a big revelation for me, because at the time of trying to start the business, it was also at the same time I was trying to more publicly share that personal story, because for me it was a sort of therapeutic process of now being an adult of a similar age to my dad when he survived the accident he was involved in, and only then getting to that age of being able to in any way empathize or try to understand, even just scratching the surface of what it must have been like. You know, he was, as I was at the time that I started this, he was someone in his late 20s with a young family. When I started this, I was in my late 20s. I had just started a family. And so the parallels were mounting up in terms of where I was in my life versus where he was in his, at the time that massive disruption in his life and our family life took place. So it was very much a coincidental timing of trying to understand safety more deeply for professional reasons and trying to come to terms with it for a deeply personal reason. And those two tied together have made it much, much easier to speak to people, and much smoother to show that all conversations are genuine. There's no hidden agenda behind anything that we say. And to take this back to the general realm of what you're asking, we as a species are hardwired to listen to stories. And if a business has a story that can resonate with a community that they're trying to serve, that can be massive. Because as a lot of businesses do nowadays, if you're focusing on technology or digital products, you're only a handful of exceptionally talented technologists away from creating something that's similar to your competitor. So if you can't compete on the basis of the thing that you can hold in your hand or the software that you can double click on to open up, that's when you can really push someone to ask, how are you differentiated from this other company that to an outsider, to a potential customer, kind of looks like the same thing? Because they perhaps don't have the time to fully appreciate the nuts and bolts underneath or what's inside the black box. So you really do have to think more laterally than just the stuff that you're making or just the service that you're trying to provide. There's a much, much deeper story to be told, and that can be what sets you apart.
Yeah, we did actually have a class last year in marketing that focused quite heavily on the company's ability to like incorporate a story into their marketing strategy was usually like much more successful in gaining like customer empathy. So all their kind of customer services were viewed much better by the customer than other companies that were just kind of doing the usual like social media posts and stuff like that.
Yeah. It's very, very easy nowadays to get into the churn, and just put stuff out there for the sake of it, or I dare say even just fabricating a story that makes it sound compelling. But where you would see a story as being genuine, I think, is the longevity of it, and how long someone or a company is able to keep that up. If a story is fabricated, you need to keep fabricating more details to perpetuate it. But if it's genuine, that's not the case, because the story in as intimate a detail as possible, and as impossible to really lie about. So any company that's thinking about their story really needs to start and end with it being true, and not just another trick of marketing. Content marketing is a big deal these days, but a lot of people who listen to podcasts, for example, traditional mainstream media don't give people enough credit for their attention span and their ability to integrate complex information from a messy conversation. Being able to tell stories in that sort of way can give people on the receiving end the razor sharp focus to be able to tell truth from fiction, and tell when someone's just doing it for the sake of having a story because that's the thing that you're supposed to do, versus someone or a group of people in a company team who have a story, and that's why they're there in the first place, because they could be off doing a million other things, but they're here for this particular reason. So let me, before you go on, I'm always interested to hear, we haven't really spoken this much detail about some of the things that you've learned in the past, and it's interesting to hear that you've come across that sort of concept of storytelling. But, from your own interest, is there a company or a story that stays with you in any particular way? Is there something that you think, that's a good example of that, or something that genuinely stuck with you emotionally?
I would say more, I was thinking of the fabricated ones. That was the ones that kind of stuck in my head just because
Oh,
that's
really?
what
Okay.
we learned about. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So the examples we were given while we were doing the course were things like BT, how they always have like the adverts that go across like 2 years.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Like the sort of modern integrated family, and
yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
I remember those. Yeah.
And I
Okay.
think another big example they gave us was the meerkats.
Yes.
So that was like what came into my head initially. But obviously, like you said, everybody knows that isn't a genuine story. So even though people are engaged with it, it's probably not as effective as like a genuine story that would engage the customers.
Those are really good examples. I hadn't thought about it in that way, yeah, because it's very easy, I think, especially in the way that I've put it, to come across exceedingly negative about the fabricated stuff. But you know, the likes of the Meerkat campaign, you can see tremendous value in that, and indeed bonus products being made off the back of that story.
Yeah, exactly.
The thing that sort of sets it apart as a fabrication, I think the word fabrication is what has the most negative connotation here, but the illustrative way to put that is that you have no problem seeing that that company could ditch that campaign at any point and come up with something entirely new.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a point of showing the difference between, you know, a genuine story that comes from the people who started a company, or why a team of people got together to start a company, versus, you know, a story that's there just as part of a sort of content marketing campaign. The true stories will always be. The true stories can't go away because
Yeah.
there's no possibility for that. But the other stuff, as clever and impactful as it is, can change in a heartbeat.
Yeah, so definitely the more personal stories are better for probably like encouraging customer loyalty, or even just like being able to portray the value easier to the customer because they know
100%.
there's like a
Yes.
personal attachment. I've only had one more question, but it was a bit more
Okay.
general. So you obviously have a busy schedule. Being an entrepreneur, you've taken on a lot of different roles, which is something that we get told about a lot at uni, about how being an entrepreneurship graduate, you'll probably take on a lot of different roles at once.
Yeah.
How do you manage your multiple time commitments at once, and what do you think is the best thing for recent graduates to invest their time in?
There's two big questions there. On how I manage my own time on multiple commitments, the short answer to begin with is not always well. To put it in full context, I still have an academic post, teaching, research. More importantly, personally, I've got a wife, a young family who need my time, who I want to give my time to. I've got some writing projects in the background that I've been trying to release for a few years, but that's been slow for all these commitments. And then trying to spearhead the beginnings of my own safety company. One thing I've really learned is not investing too much praise in multitasking. I think that gets put up on a pedestal and it should be knocked down. We are, again, as much as we're hardwired for stories, we are serial taskers rather than multitaskers. It's been a very, especially for, as I mentioned earlier, about, you know, being someone more of the mindset of liking to dance around various disciplines and sort of thinking in that rather messy and hopefully creative way. It's a very easy way to distract yourself as well. And so if you've got multiple tasks, multiple fronts on which you're trying to push forward, that can also be a distraction in its own right. And one thing I've had to really, really try hard to train myself to get better at, and hopefully I am, is going for one thing at a time and just battering down the door of that one thing for as long and as hard as I can to push that forward, and be very, very clear about what's the priority, what's the thing that's in my crosshairs to target right now, and what's the things that can sit in the background for now while I get this other thing pushed forward. So that appreciation of doing one thing well and not trying to do a million things at once is exceptionally important. And I've been horrible at it in the past. Others who I notice have managed to push ahead, like say academically, as an example, it's, noticing that deficiency in myself has made me notice in some other people that they are very much targeting one single thing and they can push for that and they don't get distracted easily. So it's trying to have and foster that level of self-awareness for me, that I can see where my current habits and traits are pulling me down, and try, just like any other skill, to foster a change in habit where I look at one thing rather than another. You had a second bigger part to that question that I've forgotten about.
What do you think is the best thing for recent graduates to invest their time in?
Not thinking that because you've now got the certificate that the learning stops. One profound change in myself recently that seems somewhat counterintuitive when you're talking about putting out social media content is really managing the amount of scrolling time on my phone and the amount of wasted time doing other stuff. When I started one of my recent projects related to safety, a big part of pushing that forward within a period of months rather than years was quantifying the amount of time that I was wasting on things that will ultimately go nowhere. And phone use and mindless scrolling is just an easy example because it's one that most people can connect to, so I'll stick to that. But most phones will give you a weekly quantification of how much time you've spent on various apps and what you've been doing with your time. And so I put myself through the pain of looking at that amount of hourly time per day, timesing it by a week, multiplying it by a month, adding that up for a year's worth of time. And when you do that, this sounds extreme, but my God, it is quite disgusting sometimes when you look at how much time you've let just fritter away on stuff that has no return. And once you see that, it becomes so much easier to see that you've got time to invest in yourself and to learn more and to upskill, because there's things that you might not be quantifying that you can cash in and to reinvest your time differently than perhaps what your current habits are allowing you to do. And that's one of the things as well that's helped me maintain this more generalist view that I'm interested in rather than being a specialist. It's understanding in some cases just how easy it can be to get 80% of the benefits by opening up time to get 20% of the knowledge. 20%, it's like the 80-20 principle. You put 20% of the effort in to get 80% of the gains. Another way of saying what I've just said is that with things like mindless scrolling or just being distracted by other stuff, people aren't finding that 20% to invest in the first place. So as recent graduates, if you think you're trying to set yourself apart, or there's a business you want to start but you need a certain bit of know-how and even just to walk through the door, don't just think I need to find the time to do it. Make the time, because there is time there to be rescheduled into something far more productive, such as learning a new skill, than it is having the fear of missing out because, you know, you didn't subtweet that day on something that someone was saying. You know, that's stuff that ultimately doesn't mean much, but you can convert that into something that is exceptionally meaningful for you in a much, much longer period of time. I'll give you one example just to close that off. Back in 2015, right, so we're in 2020 now, 5 years ago, I got the notion to learn programming. As a chemist, I'd never come across it in undergrad. Hadn't done it in my PhD. Didn't necessarily need it for my postdoctoral position, which I was in at the time, that 5 years ago. But just playing with coding 101, you know, trying a few things out 5 years ago has got me to the position in 2020 where I'm now at the outset of having a very competitive academic post that I could never have dreamed of if I never did that one simple thing 5 years ago. At the time I did it, I wasn't doing it in order to set out a particular job. I was doing it because I was a little bit interested and thought it might help with a problem at the time. I had a short-term goal 5 years ago, but it's led to unforeseen, very, very long-term gains in directions that my life can take that I could never have dreamt of at the time. And I'm not even sure I'm fully aware of what it can do for me now, 5 years later. So if you're thinking of doing it, thinking of investing that time, or if anyone who is a recent graduate listening to this gets the notion that they want to make that time, understand that there are long-term gains to doing that you might not even see. So even the gains that you can convince yourself you will get in the short term could lead to longer term things that you can't even imagine yet. So that's exciting, but tragically that's a thing that a lot of people are missing because they're not doing that first thing of quantifying how much time they're losing to stuff that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, that's something I've been looking at recently, actually.
Yeah,
this week I've put on a lock on my phone. So after an hour of using social media apps, it just locks me out of it for the rest of the day.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's superb. I've done something similar, and so do you find it's working for you?
Most of the time, I would say I do like go on occasionally after that on my laptop, but I find that I'm more aware that I'm doing it than if I just like picked up my phone. I wouldn't think twice about it. But if I actually type in like Pinterest into my laptop and then I'm like, oh, I'm doing it again.
Yeah, so it's giving you the awareness, right? There's a lot of thankfully more and more stuff out there to help us become aware of that. You know, the quantifying the time's one thing, locking yourself out like you've done to another. And all of it is hopefully giving people who pay attention the awareness to then make that next really important step of finding out what else can be done with that time.
Yeah, exactly. Because I've just been needing to make more time for myself to finish all my deadlines that are all due in one block. But it seems to be working.
Yeah, long may it last.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's all my questions that I had prepared for you for this interview.
That's lovely. So thanks very much, Sarah. I actually very much enjoyed that. There was things that you got out of my head that I forgot were even there. It's been a really valuable reflection. Hope some other people can take something away from it. Thanks.
Yeah, it's been really good for me as well to learn about the kind of other side of entrepreneurship that you don't learn about so much in the textbooks.
Excellent. Well, thanks again.